Dave, of course, we've been talking lots of Jets around here, and man, we've had a lot to talk about because, I mean, the schedule that this team has had in December. I mean, 5 games in 7 nights heading into the break, and then right back out. Um, First 3 games losing streak, and I guess in some ways, I mean, this was almost bound to happen considering what's happening with the roster. I mean, you've been doing these games. What have you seen from the Jets over the course of Boston, Washington, and now last night's loss at home to the Minnesota Wild?
Well, number one, through that phase, they've played some very good hockey. They've played good teams. And, starting on the East Coast before Christmas, played well in those games. But the line in the NHL generally on a night-to-night basis is very fine. There's a lot of good teams. And you have to execute, you have to take care of details in order to win hockey games. When you take away the quality and quantity of players that the Jets are playing without, that line just gets finer and finer to the point where you can't make a mistake. And it's a hard way to play, and particularly offensively, because in order to be creative offensively, there has to be, some coaches call it the fun zone, whatever, in the offensive zone. But if you look at the game last night and you start at 0-0 and Lowry makes a great move on a shorthanded situation, and then maybe because he's angry that he didn't score, he pounds Gaudreau in the neutral zone, and it comes back, and Spurgeon gets a goal, an unlikely goal for a defenseman late in the power play in the crease. So there's, essentially being a shorthanded guy, in my mind, that's a 2-goal swing. And going into the game, you'd say there's 2 guys in that team that can't beat you. And they're wearing number 36 and number 97, Zuccarello and Kaprizov. And they team up on the second goal. And it happens right after the first one. So now you're in a 2-0 hole. And then I thought started to play very well. And Dubois gets the goal. And then the same situation, you're on a power play, you have a chance to make it 2-2. Zuccarello steps out of the box and makes an all-world pass. And so that's the fine line it is. Because for a lot of that game, the Jets played fine, had chances. I think Minnesota is getting some pleasantly unexpected, really high-end goaltending from young Philip Gustafson. They make the Talbot trade, and Philip Gustafson the backup Fleury, and he's been terrific. But they're a hard team to play against on any night. When you're without as many regulars as you are in Winnipeg right now, they're a really hard team to play against. Now, I say that. I think I've seen Minnesota 5 times this year, Andrew. And I've done color at least 3 of those times. And been in between the benches to see them play. And when you're between the benches, you get a different feel for the way a team plays. There is no space out there when you're playing against that team. This is by design, by Bill Guerin and Dean Evason's design. And they're a team that's playing without $13.5 million on the cap for another 2 years with the removal of Ryan Suter and Zach Parise. So by design, they've become a very hard team to play against. And that's what the Winnipeg Jets ran into last night, a team that's hard to play against. Their 2 stars created 2 goals. They got a power play goal, so they were 1 for 1 on the power play. You didn't take penalties against them, and yet couldn't execute on your 2 power plays. And you say, well, we played pretty well. And you could say the same things in Boston and in Washington.
Well, I mean, you talk about the money off the cap in Minnesota. I mean, the Jets, are now so depleted. It just seems that it's one after the other. And that precipitated Rick Bowness loading up that top line with Pierre-Luc Dubois, Kyle Connor, and Mark Scheifele, which obviously made them pretty top-heavy when it came to their top scorers. But certainly, I thought that line generated quite a bit, and we saw just a beautiful goal by Dubois taking the puck to the net. What did you think about that line? But also, Dave, what does that do to the rest of the roster, as depleted as it is, when you load up the top line as Rick Bowness did last night?
I think it's necessary right now, Andrew. I really do. And I don't think – I think that was something that was thought about probably, might be not as far back as when Ehlers was hurt, but clearly when Wheeler went down and then Perfetti went down, and you'd said, okay, we have to give ourselves a chance to win. And you're 4th in the league in goals against, so that's a strength. So play to your strength. You're going to prevent the other team from scoring. And even last night, I mean, they got 3 goals, an empty netter. They got 3 goals just over, what the Jets, that's what you want to do is hold it, but you have to create more offense. So I like the move, and it puts everybody in a little better place. And, let's face it. I mean, Morgan Barron is not a first-line player in the National Hockey League. He gets a shot there. Mike Eastman, I guess, is even a better option because he's created offense at the American Hockey League level in college. But he's not a true first-line player. And so you put together 3 guys that can create offense, and they did create offense last night. They could have had 3 or 4 goals. Connor had a great chance off the backboard and wasn't able to convert it. And so in looking at that, I like it. To really realize what it is to play without 4 top 9 players is what they're playing without right now. You have to look at the fact that when they're healthy, so put the healthy line back together, assume Morgan Barron is going to play left wing with Lowry and Appleton, and your 4th line has 8 options. And of those 8 options, someone would have played on the first line, second line, third line. What are you going to do as a team? There's 8 guys that are going to be vying for 3 spots on this hockey club. And, I've been impressed with what Kevin Stenlund's done. Where does he go with David Gustafson in center? On the right side, you've got Sandy Gagne, you've got Poulin. One more on the right side would be, Jansen Harkins can play either side. Johnson Fialbi's interesting to me. Minolainen might be the best one of the group. And then you've got Esimon. So it's going to be, I'm trying to give you the blessing at the end of the curse and say, you get to pick 3 of those guys to be as effective a 4th line as may exist in the National Hockey League.
That being said, the guys last night, well, and Rick Bowness after the game said that he didn't like some of the details of their game. And, just Dave, from sitting in the building last night, one of the things that sort of stood out in last night's game, as opposed to when the Jets are at their best playing the Rick Bowness system, is that the forecheck wasn't as much there. And to be honest, excuse me, the Minnesota Wild were able to make it through the neutral zone without a lot of trouble last night. I mean, did you see the same thing? And where does that come from?
Some of that is from not playing together as a group. Some of that is not trusting and knowing what the other guy is doing. And, you talk about set lines, and I know lines don't say set for as long, but probably a pretty good idea when Wheeler's on the ice with Scheifele that each other knows what they're going to do in the neutral zone. And if Kyle Connor's on the left side there, or Perfetti. So I think there's a familiarity there that gets hurt when you have as much movement as you have right now. And that comes in the structure and the trust level of your teammate that they're going to do what you need them to do. And there's a little bit, you admire someone wanting to do too much, but it's a fall down as well, because if you try and do too much, you're not doing what you should be doing. And so I think that's part of it. It's just the trust that you have as a line mate, because there's not familiarity with the lines.
Dave, when I look back to last night's first period, I mean, you mentioned that play Adam Lowry made. I mean, he did that's his move. He does it every time when he comes in on a breakaway. He scores most of the times. And it was just the angle of that puck after beating the goaltender that went wide. And then the next thing you know, one's going in on Connor Hellebuck that he would like to have back that often doesn't really go. And when I think about last night's game, as much as some of the details that Rick Bowness mentioned, you've got 2 goals in the first period that Connor Hellebuck doesn't normally let in. So that's a negative for the Jets. And then between Lowry, that open net that Kyle Connor had, a couple of those, I mean, that in a lot of ways was the difference. The one thing, though, and Rick Bowness said this, and I completely agree, when you're depleted the way the Jets are right now, it's such a fine line, and they really have to make the most of those opportunities and not give any freebies. And unfortunately, it was sort of the convergence of both of those happening the wrong way for the Winnipeg Jets that put them in the hole that they were trying to climb out of for the majority of the second 3 periods.
If you think about it, if you really are consciously thinking about how fine that line is, it's tough to play.
Yeah.
It is. You've got to more think about the details and do what you do. And so you've got to clear your mind of how fine the line is. As hard as it is to say that, that's what you have to do. And you have to tell the guys, look, we need you to be who you are and what you are. And that includes details. It includes the fine line of doing what you do best. But, that's every night in the NHL. Like, you watch teams and you watch games and you look at a score, and I go down the right side. So the way my TV is set up, down the right side are the games, and I can flip, boom, boom, boom. And I've got a couple different setups. And so you'll see a close game and you'll flip to it and you'll watch, and it's like, wow, and I did catch the early part and then I went back and watched the end of after the Jets. I went back and watched Ottawa and Boston. Same thing in that game. I mean, that's how close, and that's the best team in the NHL against a team who's 10 points out of a playoff spot. And the margin for error is negligible. But if you think about that margin and it's magnified in your head, it's like it's what you're looking at. And so you've got to get past that.
Dave, I want to ask you about Neal Pionk. He has become, listen, there's been some ups and downs. He's had some great offensive moments, and I think he's really bought into Rick Bowness's more aggressive style. But at the same time, there certainly has been some chaos in their own end. And, Minnesota's third goal was a direct result of a decision that Neal Pionk made and then just simply getting beaten for the puck by Zuccarello. I mean, you've seen a lot of this Jets team so far. What do you make of where Pionk is at right now and what he's delivering for the Jets on the blue line?
That's a tough play with Zuccarello. I mean, he's a little thief with that stick. I mean, we were involved with him when he was still in Norway, and David Nonis was our assistant GM, and he loved Matt Zuccarello. And and we were in the final running when he went to the Rangers. And the first thing Davey told me, he said, "You got to see this kid. His stick is twice as long as he is, and he's a little thief because of it. You don't think the stick is coming as long as it's coming. It's a really hard tool to play with, but he manages to manipulate it as well as anyone does a stick of that length, and that's what happened with Pionk. But I mean, I think it's an effective pair because you've got a complement to him and Brendan Dillon. I like the pair, but physically he's going to get in some matchups where I think because he likes physical play, he sometimes over-engages physically. And the play with Jordan Greenway when he got popped in the nose on that play, which should have been, it's an aggressive play by Greenway. It could have easily been an elbowing penalty because he may have cracked his nose with that elbow. But he is willing to engage physically, but sometimes it's not wise just because the other guy's 220 or 225 pounds. So sometimes that gets him in a challenging spot. And when he could use his feet and his smarts a little bit more, because he's willing physically, he puts himself in a tough spot physically.
Dave, one of the other things that was a hot topic after the game with folks in and around the arena was the lack of a high sticking call on that one that cut up Kyle Connor. Thoughts on why that wasn't called? I mean, was this? It wasn't friendly fire. Was that what the referees thought? I could have been impactful. I mean, again, the Jets were in a hole, but I mean, that's a double minor with like 3.5 minutes left in the game. I mean, a perfect opportunity to get right back in it if it is called.
Flat out missed call. I mean, there was one. I watched the end of the Toronto game as well in St. Louis, and there was one a St. Louis high stick on a Toronto player that was flat out missed. So I saw two of them within minutes of each other, but there's no other explanation for it. And they can call that a 4-minute minor and then change it to a 2. So they've got that safety guard, and it has to be called. It has to be. And particularly when a player has the puck, sometimes, if the player has just left the area, there'll be an errant high stick, and you could see a referee missing that. But when a player's skating with the puck, they're human. They make mistakes. That should have been called. And that was a gash, too. That wasn't just sometimes you'll see guys trying to rub a little bit of blood off their lip, to try and get a 4-minute call. Man, that was a gash. And as a guy who speaks to scars very well, that was going to take a little artistry to get that cleaned up afterwards.
All right, Dave Poulin's with us from the TSN hockey panel discussing the latest on the Winnipeg Jets. So the Jets find themselves with some adversity like they haven't seen all year long. Not only the injuries piling up, but some losses as well. Home game against the Vancouver Canucks and then a New Year's Eve trip to Edmonton to take on the Oilers, Dave. I know you've seen a lot of these two teams. But what do you make of the resurgence of Vancouver with those big comebacks heading into Christmas? And the Oilers, who somehow won last night 2-1 on the back of 46 saves from Stuart Skinner, but were absolutely dominated in the shot clock by the Calgary Flames.
They certainly were. And one of the beat writers for Edmonton posted after the second period that it was the quietest and off game that he'd seen from Connor McDavid in a long time, which inevitably he comes out and scores the winning goal because that's what great players do. But, you want to finish the year on a high note. And when I had talked about streaking, I probably talked about it on the show earlier in the year, the pride of the Winnipeg Jets was that they hadn't lost 2 games in a row, let alone 3 in a row. So you've got to stem it. You've got Vancouver coming in, which, if anyone has an explanation for the Vancouver Canucks, you just don't. I mean, their best player right now doesn't have a contract. They made a long-term commitment to a different player, JT Miller. Their captain's without a contract right now and playing lights-out hockey. They've got some very good players up front. I think you've got to attack their defense, and you've got to attack their goaltending situation. But you've got to be up on your toes and be aggressive, and you've got to take care of business in these next 2 games. You want to go into the new year on a winning note. And really, you're trying to, as crazy as it sounds, you're trying to survive but amass points at the same time. And that was the idea of putting the big line together. You say to the other 3 lines, you play even. There's a great chance our big line is going to win their matchup.
Well, and that'll be a big topic going into Thursday night as the Jets try to break this skid with the Vancouver Canucks at home.